He's been very clear that he sees the United States as having no vital interests in Europe, and so therefore in the outcome of this war. But he knows that he's tied politically to this war because he vowed to end this war on day one upon returning to the White House, to the Oval Office. So this is part of our strategy of extrication rather than conflict resolution in a way that will lead to a just outcome and ultimately something akin to an enduring peace or enduring military stability.
Donald Trump says he'll try to negotiate to get Ukrainian land back from Russia during his meeting with Vladimir Putin on Friday in Alaska. During a press conference this afternoon, President Trump admitted there would be trading of territories between the two countries.
So I'm going in to speak to Vladimir Putin, and I'm going to be telling him, you got to end this war, you got to end it. This is really a feel-out meeting, a little bit. And President Putin invited me to get involved. He wants to get involved. I believe he wants to get it over with. Now, I've said that a few times, and I've been disappointed. The next meeting will be with Zelensky and Putin, or Zelensky and Putin and me. I'll be there if they need, but I want to have a meeting set up between the two leaders because there'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody. To the good, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad. It's the worst thing that's happened, by far the worst that's happened since World War II. So I'm going in to speak to Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to be telling him, you got to end this war, you got to end it. And he wasn't going to mess with me. This war would have never happened. You know, we had a discussion about it one time, and we never had that discussion again. Would have never happened. So I'm going to go and see the parameters. Now, I may leave and say, good luck, and that'll be the end. I may say this is not going to be settled. I mean, there are those that believe that Putin wanted all of Ukraine. I happen to be one of them, by the way.
Well, let's speak now to Ian Brzezinski, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO policy under George W. Bush. Ian, thank you for your time. Can we just start with your impression of what Donald Trump is aiming to achieve on Friday and how practically possible that might be?
Well, Rosie, thanks for having me on. I think Trump is looking for is a quick ceasefire so he can claim success and extricate himself from this conflict. He's been very clear that he sees the United States as having no vital interests in Europe, and so therefore in the outcome of this war. But he knows that he's tied politically to this war because he vowed to end this war on day one upon returning to the White House, to the Oval Office. So this is part of our strategy of extrication rather than conflict resolution in a way that will lead to a just outcome and ultimately something akin to an enduring peace or enduring military stability.
A just outcome, what do you think that would look like?
Well, for me, a just outcome is the return of all the territories that Russia has seized from Ukraine back to Ukraine. It's justice, that is, holding those accountable for war crimes, including Putin, for the atrocities that have been committed on Ukrainian territory by Russian forces. The return of all the children, some 20,000 to 30,000 children the Russians have kidnapped from Ukraine. And it involves reparations by the Russians, by Russia, for the destruction that they have imposed on Ukrainian territory.
Can you imagine a scenario where Russia relinquishes land they've occupied for three and a half years?
You know, I could. And people think that's far-fetched, except what they tend to do is underestimate the amount of leverage the West could exercise on Russia if it had the will. You remember, the combined GDP of the NATO alliance, and that's not all of Europe, and that doesn't include all of our allies around the world, but just NATO alone is $54 trillion. Russia's less than $2 trillion, factor of 25. The alliance spends about $1.5 trillion on defense annually. Russia, while conducting a full-scale invasion of its neighbor, still spends less than $200 billion. That's an exponential difference. Then there are the ideological and alliance advantages that the West has. So it's actually fairly amazing that the West hasn't enabled Ukraine to crush this Russian invasion. It's a matter of political will, not capability.
I mean, the person with the biggest lever to be able to exercise financial pain on Russia, and Donald Trump has threatened increased tariffs on Russia's main trading partners, is, of course, the US President Donald Trump.
Well, that's true. And, I feel we're experiencing Groundhog Day, deja vu. Last May, the president was on the phone with Zelensky, who had by his side the president of France, the prime minister of Poland, the prime minister of the UK, and the chancellor of Germany. And together they threatened massive economic sanctions. And I'm using the quotes they use, massive economic sanctions on Russia if it didn't agree to a ceasefire within 3 days. Then Russia balked on that. President Trump balked on that threat and backed away. And what we saw was an escalation of the fighting in Ukraine, escalating fighting along the ground lines, and increased savagery of airstrikes. As a result, Trump, because of his balking on his threat, put egg on his face. He undermined the credibility of the United States. He undermined the credibility of the transatlantic community, including Europe, and Ukraine paid the price. And on August 8th, just 3 days ago, he promised massive economic sanctions on Russia if it didn't agree to a ceasefire or to a clear path to a conflict resolution. And those sanctions haven't been imposed. And in fact, on the 8th, Putin showed his disdain for Trump's threats by not only bombing Ukraine again, but bombing Busha, the site of the worst Russian atrocities in Ukraine.
I mean, Trump has said, and he said again this afternoon, he's had a few conversations with President Putin where he thinks they've made progress, and then he's been disappointed because he'll say, I've had a great call, and then missiles are launched. So the US president is prepared to admit that even in the conversations he has with President Putin, he knows he's not getting the full truth.
That's true. His attitude towards Putin has changed somewhat, but he hasn't taken action on that change. His actions have indicated hesitancy in his willingness to exercise the full scope of American and transatlantic power. And I feel that actually puts him at a disadvantage at the negotiating table in Alaska, because Putin will come to the table even more convinced he can pull Trump away from Ukraine, away from Europe. He can leverage Trump's hesitancy to impose sanctions, to take their real forceful action against his aggression. And if he can actually leverage Trump's desire for some sort of reset with Russia. So this failure to exercise these sanctions is really unhelpful for Trump, and it's certainly long overdue in our efforts to stop this Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And in the meantime, watching from the sidelines are European leaders, including President Zelensky. Ukraine will not have a seat at that table on Friday.
That's true. And that's got to be very, very unnerving for the Ukrainians, first and foremost, but also for the Europeans. I mean, what's unfortunate for me is that the United States is failing to articulate a clear set of U.S.-European principles to guide the end of this war and its aftermath. And when I say European, I of course mean the Ukrainians included in that. And the Europeans did the right thing over the weekend, issuing a statement that kind of outlined what those principles should be. They include, of course, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty over and its territorial integrity, the refusal to accept or give legitimacy to the seizure of territory illegally, Ukraine's right to join any defense alliance it deems to be in its own interests, i.e. NATO, measures to provide for the security of Ukraine so that further Russian aggression will be deterred, justice for those who've committed war crimes, against those who've committed war crimes and other atrocities, return to principles and such. That was a good move by the Europeans, and hopefully will push Trump into a more constructive position in these negotiations.
Ian Brzezinski, thank you very much for your time. The former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy under George W. Bush.